Collaboration is one of the most appealing ideas in the post-separation space, and it makes sense that it would be. No one goes into a significant relationship hoping that it's going to end, and no one imagines when they're building a family that one day they will be navigating lawyers, parenting arrangements, and having conversations about who the kids are going to spend Christmas Day with. When separation happens, there's often a very genuine desire, at least on one side, sometimes on both, to do the separation well, to be the kind of separated parents who put the kids first, to demonstrate that two adults who couldn't make their relationship work can still work together as parents. That word, collaboration, carries something important in it. It carries the idea that this doesn't have to be a war, that there is another way. And sometimes there is. But the word collaboration has also become something else in the post-separation space. In some contexts, it's become a kind of pressure, a standard that people are held to or that they hold themselves to, regardless of whether the conditions for genuine collaboration actually exist in their situation. When that happens, collaboration can stop being a pathway to a better outcome for both adults and children. Instead, it can become something that serves the process or even the ideology or the more powerful party at the expense of the very children that it's supposed to protect. This episode is about understanding the difference. It's definitely not an argument against collaboration. When the conditions are right, collaborative processes can be genuinely excellent, faster, much less damaging, and far more sustainable than adversarial alternatives. But the conditions have to actually be right, and working out whether they are or not isn't always as straightforward as it might sound. Before we talk about processes and approaches, I want to start where I always start, and that's with the kids. A lot of the conversation around post-separation parenting, including the conversation about collaboration, is often framed in terms of what's fair for adults, what each parent deserves, what each parent has a right to. And while those questions matter, they're really not the primary question when the separating couple shares children. The primary question in those situations is, what do children need in order to develop well, to maintain healthy attachments, and to move through the experience of their parents' separation without lasting harm? The research on this is actually quite clear, and it doesn't say what a lot of people probably think that it does. What children need after separation is not actually maximum time with both parents. It's not an equal parenting arrangement, and it's not an arrangement that keeps them in ongoing parental conflict. What the research consistently shows is that one aspect of child wellbeing post-separation is the level of conflict that they're exposed to. Children who are exposed to ongoing unresolved parental conflict, regardless of how the time between their parents is divided, those children show significantly worse outcomes across measures of emotional regulation, academic performance, attachment security, and long-term mental health. What protects kids is not significant time with both parents. Rather, it's safety, predictability, and the experience of at least one parent who is emotionally regulated, present, tuned in, and genuinely focused on the child's needs. That evidence matters enormously for how we think about collaboration, because the rhetoric around collaborative parenting, collaborative separation, often carries an implicit assumption that collaboration is inherently good for kids and that resistance to it is a sign that a parent is prioritising their own feelings over the kid's needs. But that assumption is not supported by the evidence. In situations where genuine collaboration is possible, where both parents are able to communicate respectfully and prioritise their children, a cooperative co-parenting relationship is enormously beneficial for children. But in situations where one parent is using the co-parenting relationship to maintain conflict, control, pressure, or other forms of family violence or post-separation abuse, forcing or encouraging collaboration does not protect children. It actually keeps them stuck inside the conflict far longer and far more directly. And it's those distinctions that are so important. So when does collaboration actually work, and what needs to be in place for it to be viable? It's important that we're really specific here because this conversation can often be pretty vague. People can talk about collaboration as though it's some kind of disposition, something that you either commit to or that you don't, as though the barrier is your attitude rather than your situation or the circumstances. But collaboration is not primarily an attitude. It's a set of conditions. And when those conditions exist, it can work beautifully. When they don't, all the goodwill in the world is not going to make it function. The first condition is basic safety. Both parents need to be able to genuinely communicate without the interaction itself being a source of harm. Not necessarily comfortable, because separation is rarely comfortable. But it should be safe. Neither parent should be walking away from any communication feeling unsafe, feeling threatened, feeling manipulated, feeling destabilised. The second condition is power equivalence. That doesn't mean that both parents need to be identical in their personality traits or their confidence. But it does mean that neither parent holds significant power over the other parent that can be used to skew the negotiations. A history of financial control, emotional abuse, a history of consequences for non-compliance. They're not neutral factors. They follow people into the mediation room, whether or not anyone names them or even recognises them. The third condition is good faith. Both parties need to be genuinely oriented towards an outcome that serves their children. Not just performing the orientation, but actually genuinely holding it. In practice, this means that both parents are able to distinguish between what they want for themselves and what their children actually need based on their age and developmental stage, and are willing to prioritise that even if it's uncomfortable. The fourth condition, and this is one that's rarely talked about, is nervous system capacity. Both parents actually need to be emotionally regulated enough to actually negotiate, to be able to sit in a room with someone that they might have deep unresolved pain around, to hear things that might trigger them, and to still be able to make deliberate, informed decisions rather than emotionally reactive ones. A parent who has spent years learning that self-advocacy leads to some kind of consequence is not suddenly going to be able to negotiate freely in a mediation room just because everyone in that room wants them to. Their nervous system in that situation has a very different experience of that interaction than the process assumes. When all four of those conditions genuinely exist, safety, power equivalence, good faith and nervous system capacity, collaborative processes can be very effective. They can be much faster, cheaper, less traumatising, and they can produce agreements that both parties have actually bought into and agree with, which makes them far more likely to be sustained. The goal should always be to build towards those conditions where possible. And I don't think that's being naive or idealistic, but rather I think it's a kind of strategic realism. Litigation's expensive, damaging and uncertain. So if genuine collaboration is achievable, it's almost always the better path. But achievable is the operative word. Let's briefly walk through the main collaborative processes that come up in the Australian context because they're not always the same thing, and understanding what each one assumes is important. We'll start with family dispute resolution and mediation. In Australia, family dispute resolution, commonly called FDR, is generally a required step before most parenting matters proceed to court. It involves both parties working with an accredited FDR practitioner to try and reach agreement on parenting arrangements without going to litigation. Mediation is a similar process, though the terminology is sometimes used interchangeably and the specific structure can vary depending on the provider. Both processes assume that the parties will be able to negotiate in a meaningful way. Most accredited practitioners will conduct an intake assessment to consider whether FDR is appropriate given the specific circumstances, and this can include whether there's a history of family violence or other safety concerns. That intake process matters a lot, and it's worth knowing your rights around it. So if mediation or FDR is not appropriate for your situation, a practitioner can issue what's called a Section 60I certificate, which allows you to proceed to court without completing the FDR process. Collaborative law is a more structured process involving both parties and their respective lawyers, and sometimes other professionals such as financial specialists or family consultants, all of whom commit to resolving the matter without litigation. If the process breaks down, both lawyers need to withdraw and the parties retain new legal representation for any court proceedings. That commitment structure is both its strength and its limitation. It can incentivise genuine resolution, but it can also create a dynamic where there can be significant pressure on both parties and their lawyers to reach agreement, regardless of whether the agreement being reached is genuinely fair or safe. In the right circumstances, collaborative law can be an excellent process, but in circumstances involving significant power imbalance, that pressure to compromise, to come to agreement, can work against the more vulnerable party. Across all of these processes, the question that I would encourage every person, every parent to ask before entering is, do the conditions for genuine collaboration actually exist in my situation? Not, do I want them to exist? Not, am I willing to try? Rather, do they actually exist, given what I know about my former partner and our relationship dynamic? That's a question worth sitting with a lot of honesty. And it might be worth sitting alongside someone who can help you to think a little bit more clearly about it, not someone who's going to tell you what you want to hear, but rather someone who has the expertise to help you read and assess your situation accurately. Now I want to talk directly to the parents listening to this episode for whom something in the framing of collaboration doesn't fit their experience. The parents who have tried to collaborate or are being encouraged to collaborate, but for whom something about that framing feels really wrong. There's a version of the pro-collaboration that, in some dynamics, becomes a form of pressure on the more vulnerable parent. It can sound like, quote, think about what's best for your children. It can sound like, quote, you need to be able to co-parent effectively. It can sound like, quote, the court expects parents to cooperate. All of those statements can be true in the right context, but when they're directed at a parent who is in a dynamic that's characterised by ongoing control, manipulation, or other forms of abuse, they become something else. They become a reason to stay accessible to a perpetrator. They become a standard that is applied to one parent in a situation where the playing field is not at all level. My team and I see this regularly in our work. A parent, often someone who presents as highly functional, highly capable, perhaps working in a professional field, comes to us in a state of profound confusion. They have been told, probably by very well-meaning people, that collaboration is the answer, that they need to communicate more openly, that they need to be flexible, that conflict is bad for the children, and they really are trying. They're exhausting themselves with all of the trying. But every attempt at open communication becomes a source of new information that's used against them. Every expression of flexibility is read as a concession to be pressed even further. Every boundary that they attempt to set is met with escalation. They're not failing to collaborate because they're unwilling. They're caught in a dynamic where collaboration, as it's being framed, requires them to remain available to someone who uses that availability to continue to cause harm. And this is not a co-parenting problem, it's a safety problem. And it requires a different response. What these parents actually need is not more encouragement to collaborate. They need support to understand the dynamic that they're in, to regulate their own nervous system enough to make clear, informed decisions, and to develop the strategic capacity to protect themselves and their children within the actual system that they're navigating. They need to move away from conflict avoidant to protective, and that journey looks nothing like what a collaborative model assumes. It's also important to address something that sits underneath a lot of what we've been discussing, something that a lot of parents feel but might struggle to articulate because the language available to them has been shaped by the very professionals that are often applying the pressure. Collaboration has become in many parts of the post-separation professional world as the gold standard. Not just one option among several, but the gold standard, the marker of what a good, child-focused, reasonable parent does. And with that framing comes its shadow. Because if collaboration is the gold standard, then what does it mean if you can't do it? If you say no to it? If you look at your situation honestly and conclude that collaborative processes are neither safe or viable for you? It means in the logic of that framing that you're the problem, that you're the unreasonable one, the rigid one, the parent who's prioritising their own feelings, the one who's creating the conflict or prolonging it, or failing to be the, quote, bigger person. I've heard this from clients a lot over the years. Parents, often people who are already exhausted, already doubting themselves, who have been told by professionals who, again, may mean well, that their resistance to a collaborative process is an obstacle. And so they feel pressured to go along with it. They sit in mediation rooms feeling unsafe. They agree to things that they know aren't right because the alternative is to be seen as difficult. They feel pressured to demonstrate a willingness to collaborate because the cost of not performing that, the judgment, the label, the implication that they're the problem, it just feels like too much on top of everything else that they're already struggling to carry. When that's happening, we have a situation where a parent who's been living inside a dynamic of control, coercion, or abuse has an accurate intuition that they're not going to be able to advocate for themselves or their children within a process that assumes a level playing field. They're not being rigid, they're not prioritising themselves over their kids. They're actually reading their situation correctly. And that accurate reading is then being treated as a character flaw. And this is where we need to be really direct about a gap, a significant gap in the professional landscape. A lot of practitioners who promote collaborative approaches really enthusiastically and who apply the most pressure on parents to embrace them often have very limited training and understanding when it comes to family violence and post-separation abuse, and specifically very limited understanding of the nuances of coercive control, which is often invisible unless you know what you're looking for. Coercive control is not the same as physical violence. It rarely leaves visible marks. It operates through patterns of monitoring, isolation, financial control, emotional manipulation, the gradual erosion of a person's confidence in their own reality and perception. It's frequently invisible to anyone outside the relationship. It's almost never visible in a mediation room where the controlling person has every incentive to present as calm and reasonable. A practitioner who does not have a deep knowledge of coercive control dynamics will often read a victim survivor's hesitation, their difficulty in advocating for themselves, their tendency to defer or concede, as a personality trait, as maybe conflict aversion, passivity, or being overly emotional. They won't recognise it for what it is, an entirely logical output of a nervous system that's been conditioned over years to associate self-advocacy with danger. And rather than questioning whether a collaborative process is appropriate in that situation, Some of those practitioners instead apply more pressure, more encouragement to be flexible, more framing of the resistant parent as the obstacle. And this is not a benign error, it's an error that can have very serious consequences for the safety of the parent and the children. I also want to be speaking to parents who are genuinely terrified of court, whether they're in a coercive or abusive dynamic or not. I understand the fear of the court system completely. The family court process in Australia is slow, expensive, emotionally very tough and uncertain. No reasonable person wants to go there if there is genuinely another appropriate way. And so there are parents who pursue collaborative processes not because the conditions for collaboration genuinely exist, but because they desperately want to avoid the alternative. They go into mediation hoping that their genuine good faith will be enough, that if they're reasonable and flexible and child-focused, that the other person will respond in kind. And sometimes that might be what happens, but often it isn't. And a parent who has entered a collaborative process primarily to avoid court can find themselves in a position where they have disclosed their priorities, already made concessions, and allowed the process to run on for months without reaching any outcome that is protective of themselves or their children. They can find themselves in a much worse position than where they started. Wanting to avoid court is completely understandable, but it's not a strategy. It's not a substitute for an honest assessment of whether the conditions for genuine collaboration actually exist. Some parents can also carry a genuine sense of failure if their separation didn't end in a collaborative outcome. They can feel a sense of failure if they ended up in court or in a prolonged dispute or with a parenting arrangement that was imposed rather than agreed, as though the measure of how well they handled their separation is whether it looked collaborative from the outside. So it's important that I say that a contested outcome is not a failed outcome. Choosing to fight for your children in a system that required you to fight is not a failure on any level. In some situations, it's the most protective thing a parent can do. One of the most important things a good support professional can do is to help a parent sit with an honest assessment of their situation, without shame, without judgment, and without a predetermined conclusion about what the right process should be. There's no failure in arriving at the conclusion that collaborative processes are not safe or appropriate in your situation. There's no failure in seeking a pathway that matches your actual reality rather than an ideal that doesn't fit your circumstances. The failure, if we will use that word at all, is in a professional culture that has elevated collaboration to a standard without adequately accounting for the full range of situations that so many people are navigating. That has, with most likely genuine good intentions, created a framework in which the most vulnerable separated parents, those that are least able to advocate for themselves, are the ones most likely to feel shamed for not meeting it. But you don't owe anyone a collaborative approach or process. You owe yourself and your children safety, protection, and a parent who is building the capacity to advocate for them effectively. Sometimes those things are achieved through collaboration. Sometimes they're achieved in spite of the pressure to collaborate. Knowing which situation you are in is not a failure on your part. It's not a failure of commitment. It's an act of clarity, and sometimes it can be one of the most protective things that you can do. There's something else that I really want to mention here, and it's something that is rarely spoken about openly, even though the parents living it will probably recognise it straight away, and that is that collaborative processes can be weaponised. What I mean by that is that a person who's oriented towards control and not towards genuine resolution can participate in a collaborative process in a way that can appear very cooperative on the surface while using the process to achieve very different ends. They can use the process as an information gathering exercise. Mediation and FDR require both parties to disclose their positions, their priorities, and sometimes also their concerns. in a genuinely collaborative process, this mutual disclosure can build trust and enable creative problem solving. But in a high conflict or abusive dynamic, it can become a mechanism for the controlling party to map the other parent's vulnerabilities, to understand what they're most afraid of losing, and to then use that information strategically. The process can also be used as a delay tactic. Engaging in collaborative processes and then allowing them to stall or break down, then re-engaging and then stalling again, this can be a very effective way to extend proceedings, exhaust the other person's financial and emotional resources, and maintain leverage. Every round of failed mediation can cost time and money, significant money in some cases. For a party with a lot more resources, that can be a deliberate strategy. There can also be a performance of cooperation for the mediation practitioner while maintaining pressure outside the room. This can be one of the most insidious things that happens post-separation. Inside the mediation room, the controlling party is measured, reasonable, and seems on the surface to be child-focused. But outside it, in messages to their former partner, in interactions at changeovers of children, in the way that they speak about the other parent, either to the children or in the hearing of the children, or even speak about the other parent to others, the behaviour is entirely different. So the practitioner sees a performance while the other parent lives the reality. And without a practitioner who's specifically trained to look for particular discrepancies, the gap between the two can go completely unnoticed. Some people can also use a collaborative framework to extract concessions without there being any genuine reciprocity. So, expressing flexibility on one issue in order to extract movement on another, and then reneging on the expressed flexibility once the concession is secured. Framing reasonable boundaries as evidence of bad faith, and using language like in the children's best interests to advocate for arrangements that instead actually serve their own interests. None of these things that I've just discussed are hypothetical. They're patterns that come up repeatedly in the work that I do. The parents experiencing those things often struggle to name what's happening because the person on the other side of the table is, by all appearances, engaging appropriately in the process. But what they're actually engaging in is a performance of the process. Recognising that distinction, the distinction between genuine engagement and a performance of engagement, requires a specific kind of awareness. It requires knowledge of how coercive and controlling dynamics operate. It requires the ability to look at the pattern across the whole of a person's behaviour, not just their conduct in a particular room on a particular day in front of a particular audience. And it requires the confidence to name what you're seeing, even when the surface level of things can look cooperative. So where does this leave you practically? If you're navigating post-separation parenting, and if you're being encouraged by professionals or by other well-meaning people in your life, or maybe by your own genuine desire to, quote, do the right thing and pursue a collaborative approach, I want to encourage you to ask yourself some really honest questions before you proceed. Not questions about whether you're willing to collaborate, but questions about whether the conditions for collaboration actually exist in your situation. Can you communicate with your former partner without that communication becoming a source of distress, conflict, or material that is then used against you? When you look back at agreements or concessions that you've made in the past, were they genuinely reciprocated? Or did they simply become a new baseline from which further concessions were expected of you? When you imagine sitting in a mediation room with this person, what does your body do? Because your nervous system knows things that your conscious mind sometimes overrides. If the answer is that you feel an immediate inner contraction, a bracing, feeling just something that just simply doesn't feel great within your body, feeling like you just want to get out of the room, that information is worth taking very, very seriously. And finally, is your goal in this process genuinely shared? Not in a we both love our kids situation, because that's not actually what's up for debate, but in the specific sense of, is this other person actually willing to reach an agreement that serves our children's needs, even if that agreement doesn't serve their own interests or their need for control? If the honest answers to those questions makes you pause, that's not a reason to abandon the goal of a workable co-parenting relationship, but it is a reason to slow things down and be very thoughtful about the right path to get there. It may very well mean that a formal collaborative process really is not the right starting point. It may mean that communication needs to be a lot more structured and boundaried rather than open. It may mean that you really do need to start building your own capacity, your knowledge of the system in general, your nervous system regulation, your strategic clarity, boundaries, radical acceptance, managing expectations, before you enter into a process that assumes a level playing field that really does not exist in your situation. Protecting your kids is not the same as keeping the peace. Knowing the difference between those two things is one of the most important things that a parent in this situation can understand. If you're confused about the best pathway to navigate your separation outcome, my team and I are here to help. You can quickly and easily book a one-on-one coaching call by heading to the website danielleblackcoaching.com.au. If you go to services, which is in the main navigation, there will be a drop-down menu and you can then go to one-on-one coaching. From there, you can select which coach you'd like to make an appointment with. It's also possible for you to learn more about each individual coach if you're not sure which coach is going to be the right fit for you. We are here to help. We've navigated separation ourselves. We know what to look for, and to help support you make a clear, informed decision about your next steps. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being here with me for this conversation. I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
There's a moment where the noise stops landing, where the chaos loses its hold.
That's it for today's episode of the Post-Separation Abuse Podcast. If you found this helpful, you'll love the Post-Separation Parenting Blueprint, the foundation of everything that my team and I teach, now available to all protective parents. Whether you work with us one-on-one or navigate your journey independently, the blueprint is where everyone starts. Whether you're thinking about separating, in the early stages of separation, wanting to avoid your kids being trapped with unsafe or inappropriate care arrangements, or perhaps needing to challenge and change current arrangements, and even if you're currently in the court system for parenting matters. I created the blueprint as a gift to all of my fellow protective parent warriors because the journey of being a change maker and a cycle breaker can't be done alone, and the blueprint is the one post-separation parenting resource that gets it right. Child development, safety and well-being put first, with the evidence to back it up. The blueprint gives you the same strategic frameworks that my team and I use in private one-on-one coaching, and it's available on an online platform for you to access whenever and wherever you need. You can also ensure that you're up to date with any new announcements by checking in regularly to the website danielleblackcoaching.com.au. Until next time, take care, and please always remember, you are your child's greatest protector.
This isn't revenge, this is design. A future rewritten line by line. You don't burn it down, you build it right with wisdom, strategy, and quiet